The Prime Minister and his cabinet ministers will be in the hot seat today at the public inquiry into foreign interference. This was meant to be the last day of this phase of the public inquiry, but the ministers and the prime ministers are going to have to answer questions about what they learned from briefings about Chinese government meddling in the country's 2019 and 2021 federal elections and why the prime minister chose not to make those allegations public. The inquiry will hear from the prime minister this afternoon, and we'll be bringing you live coverage all day. Things begin at 9:30 a.m. Eastern, and we will hear from cabinet ministers, the government House Leader, the defense minister, and the public safety minister today. Once again, it's Janice McGregor who's going to be covering things for us at CBC News Network, and she's been bringing us all of the testimony from the beginning. Janice, we've already heard from the top advisors to the Prime Minister. How did they lay the groundwork for what we're likely to hear today?
It was fascinating, Heather. Let's go through it. First, a key takeaway from the senior officials in the Prime Minister's office that not only can intelligence be subjective, perhaps incomplete, perhaps open to interpretation, requiring context, but also that sometimes it can be just plain wrong. Chief of Staff Katie Telford explained that as staffers, they've grown skeptical, learned to push back at what the spy agency puts in front of them. She gave him an example of them hearing something about an MP that didn't seem right, and when they asked the spy agency for further substantiation, CSIS came back the next day, said it had made a mistake, and changed its assessment of that politician. Here's Katie Telford.
We asked officials to please go and do whatever work they could to further substantiate that and verify that. And to the credit of the officials involved, they went and they worked through the night, and they came to us the next day and reversed their assessment because they had made a mistake. It taught us not to have blind faith in or first blush trust in the information that we would see because we watched that reversal of the assessment happen.
Top staff were also clear that what CSIS tells them is not direction. This is not advice on what to do. Jeremy Broadhurst, who had security clearance to learn what the spy agency was sharing during the 2019 campaign about Chinese meddling concerns, specifically in the Toronto riding of Don Valley North, he said that when CSIS was sharing information with political parties in the middle of the election campaign, it was not a process intended to be vetting candidates. That, he said, is the party's job. They were not, he said, presenting information as like the truth, just that they wanted them to be aware that certain allegations existed. And the Liberals, in the case of that nomination meeting, went back, checked what happened, and they still believe that rules were followed and it was fair. We also learned that briefing documents that appeared to lay out information shared with the Prime Minister about election interference by Beijing were actually perhaps just talking points for the head of CSIS and didn't maybe represent what the Prime Minister's office was actually told. Senior staffer Brian Clow actually pulled out his handwritten notes in front of the inquiry. He explained that these briefings happen orally, so when you see something on paper, that isn't the same as a sheet of paper put in front of sort of the Prime Minister or people from the Prime Minister's office. And he said, in this case, what you were seeing perhaps on this sheet of paper didn't represent what they were actually told.
Most of the information in that document was not that briefing note, which was for the CSIS director. Most of what was in that document was not relayed to us in that meeting, particularly the very stark conclusions at the bottom of the document. So it again speaks to a briefing note presented to somebody who's briefing us does not necessarily mean that the person briefing chooses to actually relay that information.
So, Janice, as I understand it, it's this issue of what's said in briefings that's led to a new and remarkable request to recall the director of CSIS. That's David Vigneault. He'll be back to face more questions now on Friday.
Yeah, pretty incredible what happened around supper time yesterday, Heather. Look, lawyers representing different parties at this inquiry did not appreciate the fact that they were seeing key documents like the one that Brian Clow was talking about there in that clip, that those documents were being disclosed after their opportunity had passed to cross-examine David Vigneault about exactly what these documents meant and how those conversations went. Commissioner Marie-Josée Hogg agreed with them, and so the head of the spy agency will be coming back to try to clarify exactly who was actually told what here. I have to say, though, this matters for the journalists trying to explain this to members of the public as well, because if CSIS isn't actually communicating what's in the briefing documents that are put in front of us, we shouldn't be assuming in our reporting then that what we're reading paints an accurate picture of what people are told.